Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. I am Jared LeMay, and along with my co-host Thomas Barakat, we would like to welcome you to episode 15 and the very first Good Roads podcast. Isn't that right, Thomas?
That's right, Jared.
As you've no doubt noticed, OGRA, we've been transitioning our look and feel to our new branding of Good Roads, beginning with our Managing Winter Operations workshop, which took place in person, much to the delight of the attendees. And we'll be carrying that on to the future, the 2022 Good Roads Conference, which is back in person at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto from February 27th to March 2nd. Thomas, he's been burning the candle at both ends to set up an incredible lineup of speakers to welcome you all back in our grand return to in-person events at the Royal York. Isn't that right, Thomas?
That's right, Jared.
All right, and to tie this all up into a neat little package, on today's episode, we will be speaking to the keynote speaker of the 2022 Good Roads Conference. He is a professional engineer, a land use planner. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's of urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. He's the author of the book Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity, and the just-released book Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Transportation for Strong Towns, which we'll get to at the end of the podcast, so stick with us. He's also the host of the Strong Towns podcast, which I definitely recommend you check out, and I'll be leaving a link to in the show notes. We have with us today Charles Marohn. Welcome to the show, Chuck.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. It's nice to see you both.
No, well, we're glad to have you, Chuck. And as Jared alluded to, I've been in charge of getting our speakers lined up for the conference, for a Good Roads conference. And I got to say, I was very excited to reach out and see if you were available. And very glad to hear that you were. I've actually been a big fan of Strong Towns, the blog, over the past few years. And I think that the ideas that you guys put forward are very interesting and are very much needed for just for people in this sector. So for those of you for our listeners who maybe are not aware of you or not aware of Strong Towns, I guess you were an engineer by trade. You were described as a fiscally conservative Republican, and that's not usually the description we hear in those in the field of planning and infrastructure. So can you tell us how you went from this former, I guess, I don't even know if it's a former, but that version of yourself to the founder of Strong Towns?
Yeah. And there's a lot in that. I know over the years I've had articles written that call me the conservative and Republican. Those things might not translate well between what is going on in Minnesota and how maybe you would read that in Canada. But I certainly, I grew up in a small town. Grew up on a farm. I still live in the same town that I grew up in. I got an engineering degree, and I came back here and I started working for the local engineering firm. And I was doing all the projects that civil engineers do. I mean, I was helping to build roads and helping to build sewer and water systems and expand these things. And I always felt like I was making a positive difference for my community. I started at one point asking questions about why my city was going broke and why the cities that we were working for were always perpetually out of money. We were doing all these things to grow. We were growing really, really fast, yet our taxes were going up. Our debt was going up. We were seeing budgets stretch more and more thin. And I started to do the math on these projects that I was doing, and I found that nothing I was working on made financial sense, that there was actually a really big gap between the investments we were making and what we would need financially in order to sustain them. This came to a head in 2008 when we were having the kind of financial meltdown. Housing prices were falling and banks were failing. And through it all, I had been for years telling the cities that I work for, like, we need to do something different. And, no one, I was the chicken little of the group. And so in 2008, kind of with nothing else to really do, I sat down and started writing a blog. And I said, I'm just going to write 3 days a week, and I'm going to see either I'm crazy or the world is crazy. And we're more than a decade later, and I think I feel less crazy today than I did back then.
And I mean, that's interesting that you say that, and the observations that you had made kind of along the way into this a new revelation, I guess, and which kind of got you going. So can you tell our listeners, I guess, what the Strong Towns approach is and how it actually differs from the status quo, or what's been kind of going on over the past 50, 60 years in North America?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think as a base, if I were to explain that, I would have to talk about cities as complex systems. We have, after World War II, kind of trying to avoid getting back into the Great Depression, really simplified what cities were, and we turned them in a phrase into growth machines. The kind of machine where you just input infrastructure, you input capital, and out comes jobs and growth and GDP. And that was really important for the time because we were trying to stay out of the Great Depression. But what it did is it simplified the vast complexity that is an urban space, the vast complexity that is a city, down to a handful of manageable variables. Really, how much can we spend on infrastructure? How fast can we grow our tax base? How many jobs can we create? Metrics that are really easy to hit in the short term, but over the long term are a really bad representation of prosperity, success, capacity. And so a strong towns approach embraces that complexity and goes back to an understanding that cities need to adapt. They need to be able to evolve. They need to be able to respond to stress and opportunity in unique and novel ways. And so the strong towns approach begins with that and then layers on top of that different ways of thinking about transportation, different ways of thinking about housing, about economic development, about zoning, and all the different aspects of how we have come to assemble cities in North America.
Yeah, I want to touch on something that you had mentioned there. You talked about kind of growth patterns and development patterns, and that kind of trying to avoid a depression, that sort of thing. In some of your work, you've referenced I believe you called it a growth Ponzi scheme. Can
Yeah.
can you walk us through what that means and why that's important?
This was really like the foundational answer to that question I was struggling with. Why are the cities that I'm working with having all this financial distress, despite decades and decades of growth and investments and all the things we were doing to make them successful? When we look at modern development, because it is designed to help us reach next quarter's GDP targets, what we see is that we become really, really good at building stuff. We're able to get that new housing subdivision. We're able to get that new commercial development. We're able to get that new sewer and water project because we've found ways to construct our capital markets and our government subsidies and our public and private investments around that next increment of growth. The problem is cities, as part of that transaction, not only do they get the short-term permit fees, they get an increased tax base, they get maybe some new jobs going on, but they also take on the long-term obligation to fix and maintain all this stuff. They've got to provide the police protection and fire protection to this area. They have to go out ultimately and fix the roads and the sidewalks and the pipes and all the drainage systems and everything that goes along with this. In the short term, this is almost always cash flow positive. We've structured our system to make it cash flow positive in the short term, and that makes it really financially seductive for us to go down this path. But over the long term, what we see is that the amount of wealth that is created, the amount of investment that comes from this in the private sector is a tiny, tiny fraction of what would be needed to sustain this stuff financially over the long term. And so cities ultimately experience this financial distress. And the way they respond to that distress is to grow more and to grow faster. And this creates the Ponzi scheme aspect of this. The way we take care of the obligations we made a generation or two ago is to create new obligations for future generations. And that's a system that ultimately doesn't work.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because here in Ontario, so we actually did a study here at Good Roads, the municipal infrastructure deficit, and we had some very smart minds here, much smarter than Jared and I, do all the calculations. And we came up with a $34.7, I believe, $billion infrastructure deficit just in roads, bridges, and culverts. And that's just at the municipal level. And something we've been trying to, at least in my time here at Good Roads over the past 8 years or so, we've almost been trying to find a way to solve how to fund infrastructure. But it seems that the real question should kind of be, or what we should really be talking about, is how do we grow in a way that doesn't leave us with a deficit when you build something. It should, that's kind of what we've been grappling around with. We talked about different revenue tools. We talked about different funding programs from different levels of government, and it still seems to be a perpetual issue. And I think the way that we grow, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there, Chuck, is we have to grow in a different way that doesn't rely on more growth. And, I think something I've been, trying to push forward here is more of a fix it first type thing when it comes to infrastructure programs. Stop building new stuff if we can't even, fix the stuff or maintain the stuff that we already have built.
Yeah, it is very interesting because I've come to respect the fact that we were trying to solve a different problem, and that's how we got here. We were trying to solve the problem of the Great Depression, and I get that, and I try to respect the people who basically, put us on this not viable trajectory. They had more urgent things on their plate, but we've had decades and decades of prosperity. We've had decades and decades of times when we could have made a different choice. And your study of billions of dollars of backlog, not to not to cast any shade on it, but it's nothing new. Every city has this kind of thing. Every state has this kind of thing. The president of the U.S.'s recent infrastructure plan identified over 170,000 miles of federally funded road that was in poor condition. That plan, which is massive in size and scope, like beyond our capacity to really grasp trillions of dollars, only fixed 12% of the roads in poor condition and did that over the next decade. So even at the most massive, highest levels of spending, we're not able to maintain what we have. That suggests that we should, first of all, stop building more. I think fix it first is a nice transition kind of thing. It's a little bit like the alcoholic, acknowledging you have a mistake, you have a problem. But what we actually need to do is get to a strategy where we're making better use of the investments we already have. And that's a different development pattern, a different emphasis in terms of how we grow. It's a very simple trick to grow today if you're willing to sacrifice your solvency tomorrow. Any business can do that, can be Enron and have very near-term success. But it's the long term that cities are around for. And we as citizens should have an expectation that our cities are going to endure. I mean, that's why we have them.
So is it a matter of changing the incentives then? So that we change the way that we fund these things or build these things, or is that the solution then?
I think there's an aspect of shifting incentives, yes, but I think even more there's an aspect of shifting the place where we put our emphasis on. The subtitle of my first book was A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. And really, if you look at the problem we are trying to solve now, it's not how do we build that new thing or how do we generate enough growth to meet next quarter's GDP. It's how do we go back and make better use of all the stuff that we built. We've created this massive lattice of a city. We took these structures that were kind of compact and complex and had all this interactions that were growing incrementally, and we just hyper horizontal grew them for 7 decades. We have to go back now to that big structure, and we have to say, how do we thicken that up? How do we make better use of that? And that is going to require very block level adaptation, block level innovation, block level conversations and nuance and difficulty. So our systems actually need to be restructured to where the decision making and the emphasis, as well as the pressure and the capacity to adapt and change, are in a sense devolved down to that very block level.
So let me put this to you, sort of put you on the spot, I guess. But let's say I'm a city, I'm a community, and I buy into this. What's one thing, like the very first thing you'd say to do, like specifically?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, the one that I've been having the discussion with cities around North America over the last few weeks is about housing, because housing prices have exploded and it feels like the very urgent thing for people. I get that. What we talk about with neighborhoods is that no neighborhood should be subjected to radical change. No neighborhood should. The way we talk about it is, if you move away from a neighborhood and you come back 10 years later, it should not be unrecognizable to you. There should be no tearing down of 3 houses and building a 4-story apartment, that kind of thing. But no neighborhood can be exempt from change. Every neighborhood has to allow an increment of thickening up, an increment of change that would allow that neighborhood to adapt and evolve over time. The mechanisms of doing this are actually quite easy. We see, cities and states doing things like changing their single-family zoning ordinance to allow duplexes and triplexes and accessory dwelling units. We don't really prescribe exactly how you have to do it, but you have to look at every neighborhood in your community and say, if X is the rate of change, X has to be greater than 0. It cannot be 0. You cannot take a neighborhood and put it under glass and freeze it in place and say it will never change. That is a recipe for disaster.
Right. Change is inevitable, right?
Well, not only inevitable, but it should be welcome as part of a healthy ecosystem.
And that change has to be, I guess, equivalent to the needs. I remember Thomas sent me a link from, I think it was a story written about you, and you mentioned that you were trying to get, I guess, a new sewer or something like that put in, but the government wouldn't give you the $130,000 for it. So you went above and beyond. You were mentioning, like, we need this. It ended up into like $2 million. And like, oh yeah, sure, let's go for it. And then it just ended up costing the town more money. So I guess my whole point to that is the change has to be proportional. Otherwise it does more damage than good.
Yeah, I think that a big challenge that we have today is that it's easier in many ways to do $1 million project than a $10,000 project. It's easier to do something really big and transformative than it is to do something small and incremental. Our governments, particularly our local governments, tend to orient themselves vertically, positioning themselves kind of at the bottom of a chain of governments. And in doing so, become a little bit like the algae of the government ecosystem, right? They're just hoping that like nutrients pass through and they can get their share of them. What we need is for governments, local governments in particular, to recognize that they're the highest form of organization of a community, and they need to orient themselves horizontally around the needs of people within their community. And if we can take that step, what we see is that those projects that are the $10,000 project, or even the $5,000 or the $1,000 projects, are very low risk, and financially they're really high returning. They also tend to and address the urgent needs of people within a community far more than the $1 million, $10 million, $50 million big project that we are more apt or prone or wired to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. You also mentioned the housing crisis, and something I've noticed, and I think you guys have touched on this in your blog, is you don't really see these small scale developments that much anymore, and I think it's the same here. Where we are in the Greater Toronto area, it's just massive development after massive development, and where I live, I see a small plot of land and think, oh, somebody should develop this, but it's not. They just see and like, oh, I can't fit like a 40-story condo here, so I'm not going to bother. And the smaller developers or the smaller builders are they don't have the same access, or it's not as easy for them to kind of navigate through the planning process to kind of get these projects going. So I guess in a way we have to maybe help facilitate those types of things so that we can have this kind of bottom up type thing, and maybe local government should be kind of incentivizing that type of those types of projects.
Yeah, it's interesting. Housing is the most wicked of wicked problems. I think there's an infinite number of directions seemingly that you can look at housing and analyze it. But one aspect that I think is becoming increasingly obvious, it's something we've talked about for a long time, but housing advocates struggle with, is that more money is actually hurting the system. We are crowding out now good investments that need to be made because we have put so much money into the big developers, the big systems, the big transformational change that it's sucked up all the employees, all the materials, all the lending capital. You don't even have banks who do those kind of loans anymore in many ways. And so to be a small neighborhood developer, which was a very, very common thing. I mean, most of the homes in my little town, none of them were built by, big corporate developers. They were all built by little individuals in the past. Today, they're all built by, the big guys who come in, the big players. But back then it was all like mom and pop people who would build this house and then move on and fix up the next one and move on, or people who would, work on their own place a little bit. This is all crowded out. It's all squeezed out of the marketplace. And it's really a byproduct of how we've chosen to respond to stress. Instead of rethinking what we were doing, instead of retooling, instead of responding to stress, what we've done is we flooded the market with capital. We flooded the market with liquidity. And that has made the big players far, far stronger than they otherwise be. And it's crowded out everybody else. And that is, it's always bit the poor. It's always hurt the disadvantaged. It's always kind of robbed the working class of options. It's now starting to really bite middle class and professionals. And I think that's why it's getting a lot more attention today.
Okay. Well, I want to shift gears here. Jared had a line that he mentioned. We came on today. What is it, Jared? Good roads lead to strong towns.
Yeah, good roads mean strong towns.
There you go. So we want to talk about roads and good roads. We know that you've been credited with coining the word strode.
Be careful how you Google that, people.
So I guess, why don't you tell us how a good road can actually lead to wealth in a community and why that's important for that community?
Yeah. Well, kind of foundational to strong towns is drawing a distinction between a road and a street. And so a road in our nomenclature and the way we talk about it is a high-speed connection between two places. If you think of a railroad as being a road on rails, in a railroad, you would get on in one spot, you would get off in another spot, and there's a high-speed connection. We don't have frontage railroads. We don't have drive-through railroads. We have this high-speed connection. And so a road, it creates the most value and is the most productive in terms of its investment return when it provides that high-speed connection. When you can travel over distance at high speeds with the least amount of friction, you actually create a lot of value in the places that are connected. And, I think Toronto is an interesting example. If you look at Toronto as being a city that, in terms of North American cities, is a little bit isolated from other major cities, those connections to the outside world become really, really important. And making sure that those connections between your city and adjacent neighboring major cities, or your city and cities that lie around it, making sure that those are really strong and really quick and allow for, predictable travel times at high speeds is really transformative for your city and for all the cities that are around it. We degrade roads when we create friction, when we slow traffic down, when we do things that induce levels of congestion, when we don't, continually kind of improve the the connection between the places, and we instead focus on the corridor as a thing that we're building along. And so, yeah, I'm excited. Roads are, I think, the backbone of how we, create a strong continent. But it's because of what they do for cities, not because of what they do for corridors. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and so you mentioned roads there, and so in terms of streets specifically and wealth development or wealth generation, I should say, I think you also mentioned there has to be a human scale there for a real street to kind of have that impact on a community. Tell us more about that.
Well, if a road is a connection between places, a street is basically the platform for building that place. It is a platform for building wealth within a community. It attracts investment. It allows people to build a home, have commercial enterprise. It is the place. It is the kind of the lattice, the structure that a place is built upon. And so the way we measure success of a street is, to look at how great of a place it is. How much wealth does it produce for the community? How prosperous is it? And what we find when we start to measure those, those financial returns or those mathematic kind of parts is that it's strongly correlated to human prosperity, to human flourishing. People are drawn to great places. Great places tend to be very financially productive. When we see neighborhoods with a lot of people in them, even when they're neighborhoods that tend to be occupied by the poorest people in our communities, they actually tend to be the most financially productive. And so great streets are the place where that wealth, that road investment shows up. When we connect places, there should be growth and development in them, and that happens on our streets. And so, yeah, there's a human scale to it. What we find is that the more responsive they are to people, and let me draw a contrast, the more responsive they are to people being in the place, as opposed to how quickly we can move automobiles through, the more financially productive and successful they tend to be.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a great message there.
Right.
Okay. And, Chuck, we are getting close to the end here. So I don't want to end this before asking you about your new book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer. What can you tell us about the book? What's in it? Why should we all be reading this?
Well, the book is, I've been telling people on the road, like a deeply subversive way of looking at transportation, because it starts and ends with the insight that we are actually more in control. And by I say we, I don't mean we, the engineer. I mean, we, people living within a community trying to make things work. We have way more power and way more authority to shape our cities than we are commonly led to believe. So much of our transportation conversation today is a top-down one. It's one that is, in a sense, imposed on us, whether it's the way we fund things, whether it's the standards that are applied, the industry-accepted norms, talk about liability and what have you. And we often feel powerless at the local level to shape our communities because the transportation system is, in a sense, imposed on us. And the best thing we can do is, get a grant for this or find a way to fund something over here that we like. And the reality is that we have so much control. We have so much authority. We have so much capacity to build things the way that we want them to be built. I want people to be able to read this book and recognize that power and authority that's vested in them, and not be ashamed to speak up and to exercise it and to be part of building the city that they want to live in.
All right. That's probably about all the time we have. I know you have a hard out in about 5 minutes. So before we go, Chuck, are there any parting words you have for the audience before they see you at the 2022 Good Roads Conference in February?
Well, I'm really excited to be coming to Canada again and to have this conversation. I've had a good fortune of being out on the road a little bit now this fall with the book tour and everything that's going on. And, we're still figuring out with the pandemic and with COVID how to make this all work. We're still figuring out how to be around each other again. But it's been beautiful. And those connections are so important. The sharing of information, the sharing of ideas, the learning new things. And so I'm looking forward to it. I think it's exciting when we can get people back together again. And it's exciting when we can chat about these issues in person. So let's make it happen. I appreciate the invitation.
Beautiful. It's going to be a lot of fun. And we saw at the Managing Winter Operations workshop a couple of weeks back how excited people are to be back in person. Anyway, Chuck, thank you so much for being with us today. To learn more about making strong towns, check out Chuck's new book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Transportation for a Strong Town. It's on Amazon, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. And I believe on the Strong Town website as well, right?
Yeah, and you can go to confessions.engineer, and we've got all kinds of supplemental materials and other things that you can get on that site too, as well as every place you can get it, including your local bookstore.
Awesome. And since it's so close to the holidays and we're feeling generous here at Good Roads, I'm going to give one lucky listener a chance to win a copy of Chuck's book. All you have to do, send us an email at podcast@goodroads.ca with the phrase "Good Roads means strong towns." It's got to be in the subject line. Let us know what you thought about the episode, and we'll do a random draw on November 29th to all the people who responded. If your name's drawn, we'll buy a copy of the book. We'll make sure it gets mailed out to you. And if you know anybody in the profession that can help make roads and cities better, forward this episode on to them. Tell them to enter the contest. So with that, we'll end today's episode. And I just want to remind everybody to be sure to register for the 2022 Good Roads Conference by visiting the website ograconference.ca. There you can check out the agenda, the events, all the other speakers that'll be joining Chuck that week. And if you happen to win this book, bring it with you. We can see about getting him to autograph it for you. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Until next time, take it easy.